everyone. This video is going to cover some content from Chapter 7, which is really just studying the bones. This is going to overlap very tightly with lab, so by listening and learning from this video, it's going to help you both for lecture and also for lab. So let's start with what bones and landmarks are you responsible for in the lecture class? Well, you're responsible for everything from lab, because if you have to know it for lab, then it makes sense you have to also know it in lecture. So that's going to include all 206 bones and the divisions of the skeletal system, and we're going to go over those. It's a good idea to organize bones by region. So as you're studying and learning them, think about them in groups. What are the skull bones? What are the facial bones? What are the bones of the arm, the leg, the pectoral girdle, the pelvic girdle? Because that will help you establish relationships between bones, which will make it easier to identify them. You're going to want to know about the functions of the axial and appendicular skeleton. These aren't super fancy or super confusing, but you want to just make sure you understand the role of these two parts of the skeleton, and again, we'll talk about those. We're going to have some curves and regions of the vertebral column. These are covered both in lab and in lecture. And remember that when you're studying bones, it's a really great idea to start with the pictures in your Pearson textbook. That's the Martini Visual Anatomy, the big green book. The images, and you're going to see some of those in this PowerPoint from Pearson, are really good. But don't forget that Visible Body is going to let you rotate those images so that you can see the bones from different perspectives, and that can really help you to make sure that you get them right no matter what image we show you on a test or practical exam. All right, so let's dig right in. First and foremost, we do have two divisions to the skeletal system. So we split it into the appendicular skeleton and the axial skeleton. So the axial skeleton, if you look over here, has about 80 bones, and we split it into the skull, the thoracic cage, and the vertebral column. And then you can take each of those and sort of group them as well. So you can look at the skull and divide it up into the cranial bones and the facial bones. You've got 8 and 14. And then there's some little oddball bones in the skull, the auditory ossicles, which are like the stapes and the anvil that you learned about inside the ear, maybe in like middle school. And then the hyoid bone, which is sort of in just below your mandible in your neck area. And then the thoracic cage, we can talk about the sternum and the ribs. And with the vertebral column, we can talk about the 24 vertebrae and then the sacrum and the coccyx, which are made up of fused bones. So that's going to be our axial skeleton. And that's what we're going to focus on in this video lecture. But then you also have the appendicular skeleton, which is going to include the pectoral girdle and then the bones of the upper limb. And then we'll have the pelvic girdle and the bones of the lower limb. So you can see the pectoral girdle has 4 total bones, whereas the pelvic girdle is just going to have 2. And that's going to be due to the fusion of the pelvic bones. So pay attention to that. And then notice that in the upper limb and the lower limb, there are 60 bones. What? That's because of those hands and feet. There are a lot of little bones in each of them. It sounds like a lot, but the good news is they almost all have the same name, so it makes it a lot easier to learn them. So what I'm saying here is notice there are 28 phalanges, and there are 28 phalanges down in the feet, and 10 metatarsals and 10 metatarsals. So there is not 60 names to memorize, so it's not nearly as bad as it sounds. All right, so that's the big picture of how we divvy up the skeletal system. So the functions of the axial skeleton are to support and protect the brain, the spinal cord, and the organs in the trunk. So if you think about how the bones are shaped, it makes sense, right? Because they literally encase the brain in solid bone. That is how important the brain is. The spinal cord is also almost fully encased. And then within the thoracic cage, it's not solid bone, but you have this nice cage that surrounds the heart and the lungs to protect them. The axial skeleton is also going to provide important attachment sites for muscles, and those muscles are going to include the muscles that adjust the position of the head, neck, and trunk. So in the next unit, we're going to talk about muscles, and so we're going to want to remember all of these bones, because we're going to need to understand those attachment sites in order to understand how the muscles act in the way that they do. We're also going to have muscles on the axial skeleton that are going to be essential for respiratory movements. So we're going to need to be able to lift the rib cage for inhalation and then sort of let it collapse back down to expire. We're going to need to stabilize and position parts of the appendicular skeleton. In other words, your upper and lower limbs are attached in some way to the axial skeleton, and we're going to need muscles that attach to the axial skeleton and cross over to the appendicular skeleton, both to stabilize those joints where movement is occurring and also to help with those movements. And within the axial skeleton, we do have joints. So among all the vertebrae, for example, there are joints, and you can obviously flex and extend at the vertebral column. So the movements are somewhat limited in the axial skeleton, but these movements, because of how the bones articulate and because of the muscles that are attached to these bones of the axial skeleton, it is very strong. So lots of important things going on there. Again, just, making sure I repeat this because I do think repetition is important for learning. If we take the skull, we can divide it up into the face bones. There's going to be 14 of them, but almost all of them are paired. So really, you only have to memorize half. In terms of names. Notice the vomer and the mandible. There's only one each. The vomer will be in the nose. The mandible, of course, is your jawbone. In the cranium, we're going to have 8 bones, but 2 of them are paired. We'll have 2 parietal bones and 2 temporal bones. And then we're going to have those associated bones, the hyoid bone, which almost just kind of floats in the neck. And then we're going to have the auditory ossicles, 3 on each side for a total of 6. So let's dig right in. So our facial bones, which are paired, are going to consist of the nasal bones here in purple, kind of like if you pinch the top of your nose, those are the nasal bones. And if you move just sort of outward from the nasal bones, you're going to run into this orange bone right here, which is the maxilla. And then if we continue inward of the eye socket, we will run in to the lacrimal bone, and then in green we'll have the ethmoid bone. So kind of in that order is how I like to learn them: nasal, maxilla, lacrimal, and ethmoid. So coming back to the maxilla as a reference, we can also move out to the blue, which is going to be the zygomatic bone. That's sort of your cheekbone. And if we start with the zygomatic bone and rotate above the eye, we're going to be in the frontal bone, which is now officially part of the cranial bones. And hiding at the very back of the eye socket, we're going to have that little piece of yellow, which is the palatine bone. And then the large purple bones at the back are the sphenoid bone. Again, sphenoid is part of the cranial. Hard to see, but just visible up here at the top are the parietal bones. So that means we have officially named all of the cranial bones in this particular anterior view of the skull. Parietal back here, frontal, sphenoid in purple, visible at the back of the eye socket and just a little bit over here. And then our ethmoid bone in green, also visible in the eye socket, but it will also be behind the frontal bone, forming the base of the skull inside. Again, this is where visible body is really helpful because it lets you select and highlight bones and then rotate so you can see all the places they go and not just from one view at a time. All right, coming back to our facial bones, so we had our nasal, we have our lacrimal, we have our palatine, we have our zygomatic, we have our maxilla, and then we also have the inferior nasal concha here, also in blue, but not part of the zygomatic bone. And then our single bones are going to include that vomer, which sort of forms like the base of the nose, and then our mandible bone as well. And since I'm here, I'll just point out these are the mental foramen, and these are the infraorbital foramen. And up here, we might have a supraorbital foramen or notch, depending on the skull. Let's take an interior view. Now we can really see the frontal bone and the parietal bone, and now we can add on the occipital and temporal, all part of the cranial bones. We can see our sphenoid bone right here. And from this view, we can see this interesting structure, which is the hypophyseal fossa. And this is where the pituitary gland is going to sit. So that will be important to us. We can also see the ethmoid bone now and how much bigger it looks and how interesting its shape is. Looks very different than when you're looking at it from an anterior view. You can see the vomer. Here's our mandible down here and our nasal bone up here. Some other interesting things is we can see some of the sinuses in some of these skull bones. So here are your frontal sinuses. These are air spaces contained within the frontal bone. And here is the sphenoid sinus contained within the sphenoid bone. So if there is epithelial tissue that lines all of these sinuses, and if it gets inflamed, it creates pressure in those sinuses, and that can cause sinus pain. Some other interesting things to notice, coming back to our temporal bone, there are some important bony landmarks associated with the temporal bone, one of which is this pointy little structure here called the styloid process. We can't see it from this view, but on the outside of the temporal bone, we'd have the external auditory meatus or acoustic meatus, and on the inside of the temporal bone, we have the other side of that opening, which would be the internal. Before I leave this, let me just point out, here's the coronal suture from the inside. We usually identify them from the outside, but we also have the lambdoid suture visible here as well. Again, we usually look at these from the external view. If we flip the skull upside down, we can still see a lot of these bones, but they're going to look really different now. So notice, here's our sphenoid bone in purple. And then behind it, we have the temporal bone with a number of important landmarks. We're going to have that styloid process again, maybe looks like little fangs. But right near it, we're going to have an indentation in the temporal bone, which is the mandibular fossa. And that's important because the mandible is going to have a process that fits into that mandibular fossa. So we want to know where those two pieces connect. We can also see the large occipital bone here, with the foramen magnum in the middle. This is where the spinal cord passes through. We're going to have the occipital prominence here, which will be an important muscle attachment. And this is a good point of time to identify these occipital condyles on either side of the foramen magnum because they are going to rest on C1, which is the first vertebra, also known as Atlas, that holds up the weight of the world according to mythology, or in this case, holds up the skull. You can also see the zygomatic process of the temporal bone meeting up with the zygomatic bone. And then we can see up here in yellow the frontal bone and in orange the maxilla. You also get a great view of the palatine bone. So it's all the way down here forming sort of the roof of the mouth. But remember, we saw a little bit of it up in the eye socket as well. There's the vomer right in the middle forming sort of the bottom of the nose. And I think that's everything that we need to know in this particular diagram. I like this image of the eye kind of blown up because it really lets you find those 7 bones that make up the eye socket or the orbit. So again, notice you can see the frontal bone up here. You can see that little bit of palatine bone, sphenoid at the back, zygomatic off to the lateral side. We've got the maxilla in the inferior to medial, and we've got the lacrimal bone and the ethmoid bone as well. You definitely want to be aware of the bones that make up the eye socket. You need to know all of the bones of the skull, but you want to be able to group them and talk about them in groups. This is just kind of a great view of those sinuses that I mentioned earlier. Again, you can see the frontal sinuses. You have ethmoid sinus. There are sphenoid sinuses. And again, these are important for anyone that has sinus issues. These are at play for you. This is a section of the skull, a coronal or frontal section, so that you can really see those ethmoid air sinuses here, and you can see the maxillary sinuses. So we have a lot of spaces inside these bones that can both be beneficial, but when we have an infection or inflammation can cause us quite a bit of discomfort. All right, that brings us down to the vertebral column. There are four curves to the vertebral region and There are four curves in the vertebral column and 5 vertebral regions. We have the cervical region, which has 7 vertebrae. We have the thoracic region, which has 12. This is where the ribs come off. So there are 12 pairs of ribs. We have the lumbar region, which is 5 vertebrae. And then we have the sacrum, which is 5 fused vertebrae, and the coccyx, which is 4 fused vertebrae. So we consider these each just to be one bone. When it comes to the curves, these are very important for us and our ability to walk upright. We are born with a thoracic curve and a sacral curve, but our cervical curve and our lumbar curve develop after birth. The cervical curve development is what allows babies to hold their head up, and the lumbar curve development is what's going to enable the ability to walk. So these are important to normal development. You will or have learned in lab about the structure of the vertebrae. They are irregular bones, and they have a lot of interesting bony landmarks that you need to know about. And the different regions of the vertebral column, you can tell them apart by their bony landmarks. So for example, this is a great cervical vertebrae right here, and we know that for 2 really obvious reasons. Maybe 3, depending on how you want to look at it. But right here, we have a bifid spinous process, the 2 little ends, that is unique to the cervical region. And we also have the transverse foramen. Those are also only visible on the cervical foramen. And the vertebral body is quite small. So that's another way that you can recognize it. We are going to have this vertebral foramen. That's going to be in all of the vertebrae. That's where the spinal cord is passing through. We're going to have a transverse process on all of our vertebrae. Those are going to be important for how the vertebrae interlock as they form the spinal column. And in the thoracic area, that's going to be important for rib attachment. And we'll have the vertebral arch, which is just the part of the bone that is where the spinous process comes off and forms part of the vertebral foramen. We have a more thoracic or lumbar type vertebrae over here. We can tell because there's no transverse process on either side. We also don't have a bifid spinous process. We do still have a vertebral foramen. The body is much larger. And we can also now really see the lamina and the pedicles that help to form the vertebral foramen. I've put these red check marks to indicate things you definitely need to know, but just be aware, I won't claim that there's not a place where I didn't put a red check mark and you need to know it. But if there is one, you definitely need to know it. This chart down here at the bottom is a great way to compare the 3 major regions of the vertebral columns in terms of the vertebrae that you would need to be able to recognize and distinguish from one another. So this is a good place to spend a couple of minutes of study time. Our sacrum and coccyx, again, are made up of fused bones, so they end up just being one each. The sacrum is important because we're going to have axial skeleton attachment to the appendicular skeleton, so we'll have soft tissue like connective tissues and muscles that will cross from the appendicular over to the axial and help stabilize and permit movement. Some interesting structures or landmarks of the sacrum include the base and the apex, which kind of like the heart are maybe the inverse of what you would expect. The base is at the top and the apex is at the bottom, so always good to notice that. And then also these sort of wings that stick out on either side of the superior portion of the sacrum are called the ala. There's also a series of foramina in the sacrum. These are where nerves and vessels can exit out. And our coccyx is going to be a series of 4 fused bones. It's sort of like the remnant of a little tail that hangs off of the sacrum. Our thoracic cage is composed of a series of ribs and the sternum. The ribs are going to come off the vertebral column in the posterior area and swing around to, for many of them, they will attach directly to the sternum. These are called the true ribs, and they will represent ribs 1 through 7. But ribs 8 through 10 are known as the false ribs because they will swing around from the vertebral column, but they will join together to form a single piece of cartilage, which in turn will then connect to the sternum. So those are the false ribs, 8 through 10. And then you have a couple of ribs, a little hard to see in this picture, but 11 and 12, they end right here. They are not attaching. They just float out there. They have no cartilaginous attachment to the sternum. So those are the floating ribs. The sternum can be divided up into 3 parts. We're going to have the manubrium at the top. This is going to be important because the clavicles are going to articulate with the manubrium of the sternum, and that clavicle is going to play an important role in the pectoral girdle. And then we have the body of the sternum, and then we have this little piece that hangs off called the xiphoid process. So 3 parts to the sternum that you need to know about: the manubrium, the body, and the xiphoid process. And that brings us to the appendicular skeleton, which I will save for another lecture, most likely in class for us.